Thank you, guys. Good to be with you. We are celebrating for the next 21 months the 250th anniversary. It doesn't officially begin until next July the 4th, but the White House has already started on it. So the intent is to really focus on this for 2 years. And when you take the Declaration of Independence, it didn't appear out of just thin air. It didn't just come out of whole cloth. There were a lot of ideas that led up to what they did in 1776. We celebrate that. We look at our 250th anniversary. But it's those early ideas I want to take us back to. This is what started shaping the ideas that have become prevalent in America. So I'm going to take you back to the story of the American founding. And going back to the story of the American founding, obviously the first colony was that of Jamestown, 1606, 1607. The second colony was that of Plymouth in 1620. And with those two colonies, you actually have something that's well described in Charles Dickens' 1859 book, which he called The Tale of Two Cities. And as you look at Jamestown and Plymouth, it is the tale of two cities. First two colonies to really be founded here, from which America grew. And there was a lot of experience learned from both of them. So let me take you back, and we're going to start with Jamestown. Start with Jamestown, you go back to the landing in 1607. When they got off the ship here and landed on the coast of Virginia, they erected a cross, Cape Henry. And at that point in time, they knelt back, and Reverend Hunt and others, they knelt down, and they dedicated this land to the Lord. And there's no question they were Christian. If you doubt that, you just go back to the 1606 Charter. And if you read the 1606 Charter, they're doing the Virginia colony, as they said, because it tends to the glory of God's divine majesty in propagating the Christian religion to such people as yet live in darkness and miserable ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God. No question, Christian purpose. They were evangelical Christians, and we use that term because they clearly said we want to win other people to the knowledge of Jesus. We're going to evangelize other people. They are evangelicals in that sense. So you have evangelical Christians here. Interesting thing about the Jamestown people, however, is while they were evangelicals, they were not biblical. Can you be an evangelical and not be biblical? It seems kind of, today especially, kind of oxymoronic, but the answer is absolutely yes. So let me take you back into some of the early foundations of Jamestown, hit some of the highlights. Obviously, what I'm going to cover in the next several minutes, you can cover in years of study on Jamestown, a lot of people have. But I want to hit some highlights and kind of create some impressions that have come out of what happened in Jamestown. Certainly, 1619 project focused on Jamestown. In 2019, New York Times gave themselves a Pulitzer Prize for the curriculum they created. And they said, hey, this is... Now, why choose Jamestown 1619? Jamestown's 1607. They said, no, 1619 is when the first slaves came to Jamestown. This is what defined America. America's been a slave nation ever since. And okay, that's your premise, but the problem is it doesn't line up with history. As a matter of fact, there was no chattel slavery allowed in Virginia at the time of 1619. You do not have chattel slavery being legal in Virginia until a court case decided so in 1653. In that particular case, a man named Anthony Johnson sued to own another black man's service for the rest of that black man's life. That black man was named John Kaser. Anthony Johnson, a black man, sued to own the service of another black man for his life, John Kaser, and that's the first time you have chattel slavery in Virginia, 1653. 1619 is not even close to being right historically, but New York Times is not known for being accurate historically. So this is where the impression is, oh, America is fundamentally bad, fundamentally flawed. Well, there's no question that slavery was part of the Virginia Jamestown colony. No question it eventually became part of that. It became part of that all the way up to the time of the Declaration of Independence. So while the 1619 project, totally wrong in its history, there is the aspect of slavery that did exist in Virginia. So that's part. But that's not all that happened. As a matter of fact, if you look at some other aspects that go with those Jamestown colonists, they came here from Europe. And at the time they arrived in Europe, you just pick your country in Europe. You had a monarch. You had a king, you had a queen, you had someone ruling, and the form of government that dominated Europe was monarchy. And in that form of government, everything is owned by the king or queen for the king or queen's benefit, and all labor is to help provide for them. So what you have is an extremely socialistic system. And those who arrived here from Jamestown were part of that system. They were sent here by the king. They had a charter from the king. They're setting up an enterprise to benefit the king. What they produce will go back to the king. They don't work for themselves. They don't own for themselves. They are representatives of the king doing what they do for the king. It was a socialistic system, as all of Europe was at the time. So the king, with this new colony over here, is supposed to take care of them and send them the supplies they need, but the king has a lot bigger colonies all over the world, and he didn't really think of Jamestown near as much as he should have, and so the supply ships did not often arrive as they should. And the Jamestown colony started just with a small group and got to be a few hundred after a couple of years, 300. They didn't have all the supplies they needed. So what they did, and the mentality they had of the government takes care of us, they went to the Native Americans and said, hey, you guys do realize you're living on the king's land. The king owns this land, he's claimed it, and we're sent here by the king, and you need to help take care of us because we're on the king's commission. So for the first 2 years, the Indians actually helped provide for the Jamestown colonists and did a great job. Relations were good. They helped provide the food they need, etc. And again, we're talking socialistic here. We're talking provide me what I need. The productivity of the Jamestown colony was pretty poor. It was not particularly high. And so they were relying on other supplies coming in. And it was bad enough that after the second year, Governor John Smith said, guys, this is not a workable model. This will not work in the future. We've got to make some changes here. And he actually quoted to them out of the Bible. He quoted to them out of 2 Thessalonians 3:10 that says, he that will not work shall not eat. He said, we're changing. You're all going to work. You're all going to find something to do. You're all going to be productive. Well, they didn't care for that, and so they tried to blow him up. Didn't quite kill him, but sent him back to Europe so he could get medical treatment. So it doesn't matter to them. He's out of our hair, so he's gone. So we're going back to what we did before. And so as the third year came, they went back to the Indians and said to the Native Americans, hey, we need some more food this year. And the Native Americans said, not this year. We've been trying to help you the last two, but we've got to provide for ourselves, and this has been really tough for us too. We're not going to provide for you also. So that third year, they ended up not providing for the colonists, and the colonists had not provided for themselves, and they had not done a good job of working their productivity. And so they went into that winter, and that winter became known as the starving time. That's the winter of 1609, 1610. In that period of time, in that starving time, they had not produced the food they needed to go in. And so as a result, when they get in that starving time, they entered that winter with 490 colonists in Jamestown. They came out of the winter with only 60 colonists left. So you have 430 colonists that died of starvation in the winter. Well, as they get into this, they haven't prepared for it, and you start getting hungry, and you're looking for stuff to eat, and you start finding what you can. Whether that's frogs or snakes or crickets or whatever, but that doesn't last long. And so they kind of moved up to the next size of animal, which we would probably call the pets, the cats and the dogs, etc. Then that didn't last long, and so they moved up to their forms of production, started eating their horses and their cows, which is supposed to be producing for them for the future, and they run out of that. They've run out of everything, and they've still got months to go. And what do you do? And somebody said, hey, we've buried a whole lot of people that have died already, and they're over in the cemetery, and they probably had meat on their bones when they died. They literally went to the cemetery, dug up the corpses, ate the meat off the corpses. They literally engaged in cannibalism. As a matter of fact, one man, his wife was pregnant. He killed his pregnant wife and ate his wife. As you can imagine, government officials executed him for doing so, and then they ate him after they executed him. The whole thing. So you come out of this thing with 60 people left. So as they come out, they said, we're never going to do this again. So as a result, when they come into the next spring, they start Indian wars. They start attacking the Indians. You guys are going to provide for us. We're not going through another winter like this. They even kidnapped Pocahontas, and Pocahontas had been one of their greatest advocates for whatever reason back when they first arrived, and she was, 9, 10, 11 years old. Nobody knows exactly, but it's real low. When they arrived, she liked them, and since her father is the king, she was able to get a lot of the supplies brought to them. And so she already had but now they've kidnapped her, and they hold her hostage and said, if you don't bring us food, who knows what'll happen to your little daughter here. And so it's kind of a blackmail situation, and it's not a good situation. So when you look at Jamestown, in many ways, you say, all right, they're elitist because they still have this class distinction of we're business people from Europe, and therefore you need to provide for us. They are socialistic, and that they did not work for themselves. They wanted someone to provide for them. They were pro-slavery. Not always at the first, but they became that as they needed more productivity in the colony and more work to be done, and they're not going to be the ones doing it. And then big government, relied on the government to meet all of their needs, and then they're also group conscious, and depends on what group you're in, and so it was not the concept that all people are equal. Some are better than others, and some are in different groups. So that's part of Jamestown. Now, Jamestown is part of our Christian heritage, no question. What they did at the Jamestown with the declaration there when they landed, and what was the charter, 1606, 1607, all that, it's very favorable stuff. But as you look at the operation in Jamestown colony, there's much that's not favorable in that colony. So when you take and look at Jamestown, that's why it's an easy target for the 1619 project, because there are things that happened here that you can take and make plausible because of the nature of what's happened. But as I told you, that's not the only picture of America. The Tale of Two Cities is, we'll call it the 1620 project. We'll call it the Pilgrim project. It's the other city. So when you go to the Pilgrims, it's interesting. This picture actually hangs in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. It is one of 8 paintings that hangs in the rotunda of the Capitol. It is 14 feet high. It is 20 feet wide. It therefore is essentially a life-size picture of what happened. This is the embarkation of the Pilgrims coming from Holland to England and then on to America. So what you have here in this group, it's interesting that the prominent thing you see in this group is this Bible right there. It's significant that nearly any picture you find of the Pilgrims in any textbook, you'll nearly always find a Bible with these guys. Now, isn't that interesting that you find that in virtually every Pilgrim picture? Now, by the way, that Bible right there, you see the size of it? That Bible held there is actually called the world's first pocket Bible. Now, I'm not sure the size of your pocket. That won't fit any pocket I've got. But they called it that because the Bibles previous to that were called pulpit Bibles. They were about 4 times as large. They were big folio Bibles, and they were chained to the pulpit of churches and had been for centuries. You don't own your own Bible. The king tells you what you need to believe, and you can't believe what you want to believe. You believe what the king believes. This is the first Bible that an individual could actually own and carry around with them. It's the first translation of the Greek, first translation of the Bible into English, and it was done in 1560. It was done out of Geneva, therefore it's called the Geneva Bible. That was the Bible that the early settlers brought to America, was that Geneva Bible. The King James is still yet to come. It's way off in the future from when that Bible was first published. So they get around that Bible, and it's significant that you find that Bible in nearly all the pictures of the Pilgrims. Now, with that Bible, over here on the side, this is their pastor, John Robinson. And you have to understand that the Pilgrims are not a political colony. They're not an enterprise colony. They are a congregation coming to America. They had been in England, but their former pastor, Pastor John Greenwood, he made the statement, he said, Jesus Christ is head of the Christian church. Queen Elizabeth took exception with that, said, no, I'm head of the Christian church. She executed the pastor for saying that Jesus was head of the Christian church. That's how radical that theology was back then. So they lost their first pastor because he said, Jesus Christ is head of the church. And she said, no, I am. I will tell you what to believe and what you do. So at that point in time, that's when they left and went to Holland. And in Holland for 12 years, and in 1619, they did a publication in Holland that criticized what the Church of England was doing and how unbiblical it was. It made the leaders in England so mad that they sent people to Holland to harass them and drive them out of Holland. And so finally, they leave from Holland, they head for America. They're coming over on 2 ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower. As it turns out, pairs of the crew didn't want to go to that new world, so the crew sabotaged the Speedwell, drilled holes inside to take on water. Hey, we can't go, we're sinking. So the Mayflower is the only one that made it. So he never made it to America. It's a congregation coming. 2 ships, didn't make it, but as they are sitting out for America, he says, now, when you get to that new land, do not take the darkness of the old world with you. You have God's word. You use God's word to create your culture. You do what God's word says. You don't do what we've been doing for the last several centuries. So they take off, and as they get, that one boat makes it the Mayflower, As they come up on the coast of Massachusetts, before they get off, they said, look, we're covenant people. The Bible's filled with covenants. We're a church that believes in covenants. We need to make a covenant with one another. And they did so, and the covenant they made was called the Mayflower Compact. That ended up being the first civil governing document drafted in America. The Charter for Virginia was drafted in England and brought to America. This one was drafted in America. So as you read the Mayflower Compact, it too is very evangelical. They say, hey, this congregation, we've undertaken this for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. We've taken this voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. And you go, Northern Virginia? That's Massachusetts. When you look at the maps back then, the mentality of the king, you look at the map for North America, the whole thing is called Virginia because he owns it all. I landed here first, I own it all. So they're in northern Virginia, which is Massachusetts area, but it was all Virginia from the king's standpoint. So this is what they've undertaken. So as they're there, they said, now, you know, Pastor Greenwood told us not to take the practices of the old world with us. So what are we going to do for government when we get over here? Because we're landing at a place that has no government at all. We're landing at a place with no people, no government. We need government. The Bible tells us very clearly we need government. What are we going to do? So at that time, they start having discussions about government. Now, in the Bible illustrates 7 different forms of government. And as you go through the Bible, you say, what are we going to choose? What do we pick? Which one do we do? And what they landed on was the Hebrew Republic. So God had his people in bondage for years, then they get out. He leads them in the wilderness. He gives them the law. They establish the Hebrew Republic, and that becomes the model that they want to follow. And part of that Hebrew Republic, you have Exodus 18:21 that says, choose out from among you leaders of tens, 50s, hundreds, and thousands. Choose able men such as fear God, men of truth, hated covetousness. They said, okay, so we want a republican form of government. We're going to choose the Hebrew Republic as our model, which means we choose our own leaders. And we choose leaders of tens, 50s, hundreds, and thousands. And your qualifications for office are able men such as fear God, men of truth, hated covetousness. So they decide to have elections. And what they do is they establish elections, but they say, how often should we have elections? The Bible doesn't tell us. So they say, let's do it every year. So they elected their governor, their civic leaders every year. That's why William Bradford, one of their most famous governors, he served 30 terms as governor of the Pilgrims. 30 terms? We're used to 4-year terms. They had 1-year term. He was elected 30 times to be their governor. There were 7 or 8 other people also elected across that period of 40, 45 years, but he served 30 terms. So they have annual elections. But the other thing they did at the start of the Bible was they separated the institutions. If you go back to the Hebrew Republic, after God had given the 613 laws to Moses and had that, and he had everything set up, he said, now here's what I'm doing. Moses, you take all the civil stuff, and Aaron, you take all the temple stuff. So God's got clear laws, but he made 2 separate institutions, and he didn't put one person over both of them. He separated a leader. I've got a leader over the temple stuff, and I've got a leader over the civil stuff. Now, that's not what Europe is doing. Whoever was the king was in charge of the church, which is why they killed the pastor of the Pilgrims for saying Jesus Christ is head of the church, because Queen Elizabeth said, no, I am. And so if you're in France, if you're in Italy, you are going to be Catholic. If you're in Germany, you're going to be Lutheran. And if you're wherever you are, that's what you're going to be. And so you're going to be Anglican if you're in England. But the Pilgrims said, no, that's not the model. And so they literally separated. And by the way, there's a great story in the Bible in 2 Chronicles 26 of King Uzziah. King Uzziah was a king who was particularly blessed of God. He had a 52-year reign. Over that period of time, Israel had remarkable times of peace and great prosperity. A lot of the reason they had peace was he was such a great inventor of weapons of war. He actually invented catapults that would reach further than any catapults in the world. So when an attacking enemy came after him, he's pounding them before they ever get in range to attack Israel. So he had great peace. The Bible also talks about the great inventions of war he did. Now, I don't know what they are, but when I try to visualize it reading the scriptures, it sounds like he created a Gatling gun for arrows, which would have been just amazing back then. So he had all these inventions of war that brought peace for 52 years. He served God, and he finally said, you know, I'm gonna go to the temple and thank God for all the blessings he's given us. I'm going to offer sacrifices. And so he goes in, he goes to offer sacrifices, and when he does so, the priest said, no. We're the priest. We do the sacrifices. You're the king. He said, I am the king. Don't tell me what I can and can't do. So he went to the temple. He offered the sacrifices of thanksgiving. And at that point, God struck him down at the altar. He went out. He was covered with leprosy. He died shortly thereafter. God made it really clear that even though you're a God-fearing man, I have established two separate institutions, and I don't want the same person running them. And so the Pilgrims saw that very clearly, and so they separated the institutions. So in addition to separating the institutions, they had annual elections for both civil and religious leaders. Just like they elected a governor every year, they elected a pastor every year. And so it was the choice of the people. They chose their spiritual leaders, they chose their civil leaders, and they did so every year. So this is what led to the rise, really, of the good things about religion, because it ended the state-established church, and ending the state-established church led to the rise of the rights of conscience and religious toleration. So this goes back to the Pilgrims, and it's not the Puritans, this is the Pilgrims, and they said, no, this is a conscience right, and so they had a whole different approach to anybody in Europe at the time, and this is what they saw in the scriptures. But in addition to what they did with the elected government, they got here and they were a congregation coming to live here together. And so they actually kind of followed what we see in Acts 4, where the early church had everything in common. They practiced a Christian socialism. We have everything together, we're sharing everything together, but they've landed in a wilderness. It's really tough to live there. And Governor William Bradford talks about how hard it was and that they had the common pot, shared everything in common. But because everything is shared, a lot of people said, this is really hard over here in this wilderness. I don't know that I want to do this. And so even if they didn't work hard, they still got a share of everything because everything was split between them. It was really kind of Christian socialism, what it amounted to. And after a couple of years, it was so bad, they said they had to make a change. And the change was the free enterprise system. This is where you see the introduction of the free enterprise system. And there were several Bible verses they pointed to. They too pointed to 2 Thessalonians 3:10, that if you don't work, you don't eat. We don't care if you are part of the congregation. If you don't work, you don't eat. That's what the scripture says. But then 1 Timothy 5:8 says, if you don't provide for your own household, you're worse than an infidel, and you've denied the faith. Scripture says. You provide for your own household. We hadn't thought about that before. So suddenly now you're responsible for your household and nobody else is responsible for you. You are. And so there's several other teachings in the Bible that deal with economics and how to run economics in the free market system. You got Matthew 25 and Luke 19 and Matthew 20 and all these passages. And they're finding out, and Governor Bradford said that after they went to the free enterprise system, and by the way, this is the first free enterprise in America, free enterprise building in America, or business in America, done in 1627, and nothing in Europe like it at the time. And Governor Bradford said that when they switched over to the free enterprise system, their productivity increased sevenfold, and they never had another time of want in the Massachusetts colony. So after having hardship for the first couple of years, they suddenly are now more productive than anything else, and they were the most productive colony throughout all the way up to the American Revolution. And what Massachusetts did was unheralded. They were the most prosperous colony of all 13. So in addition to the free market kind of system that they came up with, private property was a big deal to them, and they believed that they should not take private property from the Indians, and regardless of what the king said, it wasn't his property. It belonged to those who lived here and owned it. And so as they arrived in Massachusetts, they're looking for a place to come ashore, and they're careful to try to find some place that is unoccupied, some place that is not owned by anyone else. And they finally pick that place and come ashore. Now, they arrive in December 1620, which is a really bad time to land in Massachusetts. It's December 1620. Very cold, very harsh. They lost half the people that winter. But they start building lodges and houses for them. They start building a village. And as they make it through that winter, having lost half, they come into the next spring, and lo and behold, a native named Samoset's come wandering into the camp. And he's kind of like looking around and said, man, when we went into winter camp, you guys weren't here. Where'd you come from? What is this? And he doesn't speak English very well, but he speaks some English, and they hear English, and they're excited because this guy speaks English. They start peppering him with questions. He said, I don't speak English that well. Let me go get a friend. And he brought back Squanto. And Squanto was fluent in English. Squanto had been kidnapped years earlier and taken. He was being sold as a slave in Spain when a bunch of Catholic priests saw him and bought him and said, this is wrong. And they bought a bunch of the Indians that had been kidnapped from America and freed them. And so now Squanto is over in Spain, and he's looking at huge cathedrals and these big buildings and carriages, things he's never seen in the New World. He is just intrigued with and so he stayed over for several years. He went over to England, lived in England several years. He learned how to speak the white man's language, learned their custom, learned their thinking, and he finally says, I'm going back to my home. And so he goes back to Massachusetts. When he got back, turned out the entire tribe that he had been wiped out by plague while he was gone. He's the only survivor of his tribe. And the Pilgrims happened to come ashore where his tribe had been living in the years before they were extinguished. So he's back at his old home site and talking to these guys and finds that they have no clue what they're doing over here. They don't know how to live. And it's kind of like he feels like he's got this call from God. I can help these people. I can mentor them. I can show them how to live here. And that's what happens over the next 2 years. He adopts these people. He shows them how to live there, how to farm, how to handle the wilderness. And they're concerned about the land they're living on. And so Squanto connects them with Chief Massasoit, the chief of the Wampanoag Indians there. And they say, hey, we don't know who owns this land. Can we buy it? We don't want to have somebody else's land. Can we purchase this? And so they work out a deal and they purchase the land where the Pilgrims are living. So that's the beginning of really the private property concept. Doesn't matter what the king says. Somebody owns that land and we've got to make an arrangement where we purchase it. And it's striking that when you look at that, even 2 generations later with that Massachusetts colony, Governor Josiah Winslow, he said, I think I can clearly say that the English did not possess 1 foot of land in this colony, but what was fairly obtained by honest purchase of the Indian proprietors. Every square foot we've got, we have a title deed we can show you for that square foot. And it was an agreement that they had agreed to and that we agreed to. It's mutually beneficial for both sides. And so significantly, the longest lasting treaty in American history between Anglos and Native Americans was with this Massachusetts colony. And when the treaty was finally broken, it was the Indians who broke the treaty, not the white guys who broke the treaty. So this concept of private property and not owning anybody else's private property unless we got a title deed for it, that goes back to the Jamestown folks. In addition to that, civil rights was a big deal because every nation in the world at that point had slavery. You can't find a nation that didn't have slavery. All the continents had it. It's part of what's going on, but the Pilgrims did not like it and felt like the Bible was against it. And they said, you know, eventually there's going to be slave ships that come here to our colony. And when they do, what are we going to do? So they passed the first anti-slavery law in 1641. It was based directly out of the Bible. They quoted it out of the Bible. We actually have their law books from back then. We have about 100,000 documents from American history, starting with Columbus and going all the way up to the current administration. So we've got lots of documents on these guys. We have 2 world-class museums in Fort Worth, Dallas area. At the one over in North Dallas, we've got about 1,300 documents from the Plymouth, Jamestown area. So we've got a lot back on these guys. And so we have their law book, and the laws, all these laws they passed, they published in 1650 in one book. It's called the Code of 1650. So part of that code, you see right here, law number 10, if any man stealeth a man or mankind, he should be put to death, Exodus 21:16. Man stealing, slave trade. You go somewhere else, you steal someone, you bring them over, put them in slavery, that's man stealing. That's capital offense. So this is the law they passed. Well, 5 years later, slave ship came to their harbor. And the captain gets off, says, got slaves, who needs slaves? We got plenty of slaves. And that's what they do in every other harbor. And the Pilgrims said, you got what? We got slaves, how many do you want? We don't allow slavery here. So they arrested the captain, they sentenced him to death, and he pleaded ignorance. I didn't know anybody didn't have slaves. Everybody's got slaves. And, well, now you know, so don't ever come back here with another slave. They made him take the slave and return to where they'd been stolen from. So they did what they could to make sure restitution happened, but they're not going to be part of the slave trade. They're just not part of it. Bible is really clear. So you see a very clear anti-slavery position from these guys from the very start, anti-slave trade. And this is why in 1792, this is an editorial cartoon that appeared in a newspaper in Boston in 1792. We have that newspaper. It's called the Equality Ball. What you see there is Governor John Hancock on the left. He's shaking hands with a black man named Paul Cuffey. Paul Cuffey was the wealthiest black man in America. He lived in Massachusetts. He and his 3 sons ran a global shipping business that shipped all over the world, very prosperous. And they're celebrating the fact that in Massachusetts, blacks and whites are equal. As a matter of fact, this man, early black U.S. Congressman, Robert Brown Elliott, said there never was a time in Massachusetts history when blacks and whites weren't equal. Significantly, we don't hear this about Black History or Black History Month anymore. As a matter of fact, if I were to take this guy right here and say, Matthias D'Souza, who's Matthias D'Souza? Most of us don't know. Matthias D'Souza is a black man in Maryland. He's a black man living in a white community in Maryland. He's a black man chosen by the white community to be their representative in the state legislature. So he's elected to the Maryland state legislature in 1641 as a black man in a white community. Yeah, but then I could bring up people like Wentworth Cheswell. He's in the founding era. He made a Paul Revere-like ride, just like Paul Revere did his in New Hampshire. He's a black man living in a white community in New Hampshire, He's elected to office in 1768. He's reelected for the next 49 years. He held 8 different political positions. He's considered the founder of the public library system, public school system in New Hampshire. Great patriot, great, a black guy in a white community, served in the legislature. Yeah, as a matter of fact, by the time we get to 1876, there's been more than 1,000 black elected officials in America by 1876. Now, if I can put that in perspective, let's take Great Britain. When did Great Britain elect their first black individual to office? 1987. If I take something like Russia, when did Russia elect their first black individual to office? 2010. How about Italy? 2013, and on it goes. Wait a minute, we got 1,000 black officials elected by 1876, and we're the racist nation in the world? Pardon me, that doesn't hold up. That just means we don't know our own history. And a lot of it goes back to what happened with the Jamestown colony. So 1641, we have our first black elected official, but going back, civil rights was big to the Pilgrims. And then public education, because these guys have picked up everything they have in Europe. They come over here. This is going to be their permanent home from here going forward. What are they going to do with their kids? Because their kids need an education, and they're very concerned about their kids having an education. And so they create a school system in America. It's really the first school system we have in America. It is part of that code of 1650. 1643, they passed the first education law. 1647 is the second education law. And that first education law explains why they need a school system to teach kids. And the title of that law is fairly interesting. It's called the Old Deluder Satan Act. Now, interesting title for a public school law, but here's what it says. It says, it being the one chief project of that old deluder Satan to keep men from knowledge of scriptures, we've just come out of hundreds of years where people didn't know the scriptures. And look at the abomination of behavior that went on in those hundreds of years. We're going to a new place, and we don't want that oppression coming with us. So we're going to make sure everybody knows the scriptures, because Satan's chief project is to keep us from knowing the scriptures. And so what they want is they want the Bible in schools, absolutely, because that's the source of civic freedom, economic freedom, all those types of freedom. So that's where they start, and significantly, what they did different from Europe was they thought that everybody needed to read God's Word. Now, in Europe, education, that was for the higher classes, and it was for the men, not for the women. Women didn't need an education. In Massachusetts, everybody got an education, boys and girls. It's interesting that Massachusetts had a higher literacy rate for women than any place in Europe. You take the great cities, you take London, you take Rome, you take Lisbon, you take any of the great cities. Massachusetts, backwoods of Massachusetts, had a higher literacy rate for women than all across sophisticated Europe. Yeah, because of that first public school law, and it continued that way across the next several centuries. You can go through virtually any state, but I'm going to just pick some states here randomly. This is some of their laws. This is New Jersey, and this is an 1816 report from Public Education in New Jersey. And 1816, they're talking about what's happening in what they call the first and second classes. We would call that the first and second grades. So here's the report, and the official report says, all the scholars of the first and second classes commit to memory portions of the New Testament or Psalms, a lesson of the Catechism, several hymns, and the text of the preceding Sabbath. So everybody in what we call the first and second grade is memorizing parts of the New Testament and Psalms and Catechism and hymns, and what's the text of the preceding Sabbath? Wherever you went to church on Sunday, whatever Bible verses your preacher mentioned, we're going to memorize those. That's the text of the preceding Sabbath. Whatever the preacher talked about on Sunday in the pulpit, that's what we're memorizing this week. So you're doing this the first and second. Now, we all know that in any class, some kids are smarter than other kids. They tend to be sharper. You always have one of those guys in your class, one of those girls in your class, and they had one here. Talked about one of the scholars, now we're talking first and second grade, one of the scholars committed to memory the book of John and the first 30 Psalms together with the 119th Psalm. First and second grade, memorized the Gospel of John, 30 Psalms, and Psalm 119. We know that all the kids weren't that smart. Matter of fact, he said so. He says the majority have committed to memory the Gospel by John. All of our first and second graders memorized the Gospel of John, but we had one kid who also memorized 30 chapters of Psalms and Psalm 119, but everybody memorized the Gospel of John. Dare I challenge you to be as smart as a second grader in New Jersey in 1816? No, how many Christians have memorized the Gospel of John? And this is education in New Jersey, 1816, at least in that school, in that system, in that superintendent. And let me take you to Pennsylvania, 1892. This is the head over the system is saying, all right, I want two things memorized every week by the students. And one's going to be from the Bible and one's going to be from literature. Here's how he explains it to the teachers and classes. He says, let the memorization selections for the week be, if possible, 2 in number. The first from the Bible or sacred song, and the second from the world of literature, prose, or verse. Say, let's memorize the 90th Psalm and Lincoln's speech at Gettysburg. That's 1 week memory work. Or 1 week, let's memorize Lead Kindly Light and Longfellow's Psalm of Life. Or 1 week, let's take the 23rd Psalm and Lowell's Once to Every Man or Nation. 1 week, let's do the 19th Psalm and Home Sweet Home, or My Country 'Tis of Thee, and the Chamber of Nautilus, or the 13th chapter of Corinthians and the last rose of summer, or any of the other hundreds of good things, moral, religious, patriotic, descriptive, or sentimental, in the best sense of the word, that we should all be very glad to have securely lodged in the memory. Pennsylvania Public Education in 1892, every week kids memorizing a chapter of the Bible and something from literature. And by the way, I love the last part. He says, and let the teacher always commit to memory what's here required of the pupil.
Yes.
Yeah. Don't just tell the kids to do it, you do it too. So education, very different than what you have in the Virginia model, which again was education for the elites, wasn't public education at all. And the final thing I'd point to is due process. And this is where you can fault the Massachusetts colony, because these guys, I mean, these are the intolerant Christians. How do we know they're intolerant? Because they killed all these witches. They come here for their own religious liberty, and then they kill all the people that don't practice what they practice. And okay, so let's talk about the Massachusetts witch trials for a minute. How many people were put to death? 27 people put to death in Massachusetts witch trials. Not good. How long did those witch trials last? 18 months. Not good. But that's not the thing we should be looking at here. You see, witch trials were going across the entire world at that time and lasted about 200 years. The witch trials covered the world, most of the countries across Europe. So the question to ask here is, wait a minute, why did the witch trials in Massachusetts come to an end after only 18 months when they last for decades and centuries in the rest of the world? And the answer is because 3 Christian ministers, Reverend John Wise, Reverend Increase Mather, and Reverend Thomas Brattle, they went to Governor Phipps and said, Phipps, what you're doing here is wrong. You're just copying everybody else in Europe. Here's what the Bible says. And they showed him out of the Bible due process and how due process to be handled, said, you're just copying Europe. And so Phipps agreed. He said, this is wrong. He ordered a stop to the witch trials. That's why they stopped. He realized that they had shed innocent blood, which Scripture makes really clear brings a curse on a nation. And so as a result, the legislature stepped in. They declared all the trials illegal. They then took all the names of the 27 people that had been involved, and they expunged the names from all the records. That's why it's hard to find who the 27 people are today, because they didn't want them tainted with a bad trial, with a bad verdict, something that shouldn't happen. So they expunged the names, and then they went and paid restitution to every family that lost a family member. They said, you know, you lost a mom, you lost a dad, you lost a brother. We need to do something to show that we've really messed this up. So they paid restitution in all those areas. Now that part of the witch trials never comes out in textbooks. But going back to the witch trials, they went to Judge Samuel Sewell and said, you can't do this anymore. We're not going to copy Europe. We're stopping the trials here. And so that's how all this stuff came to an end, was when 3 ministers went and confronted the civil leaders and said, here's what the Bible says about what you're doing. Now, go back to the rest of the world. 2 centuries, witch trials. How many people were put to death in the witch trials in the rest of the world? 500,000. How many in America? 27. How come we all know about the 27, never heard anything about the 500,000? We do everything we can to make America look as bad as she can. We don't put it in perspective. Yeah, we're humans too, and we made plenty of mistakes. We just got out of our mistakes faster than anybody else. We're the first nation in the world to have a law to go into effect banning the slave trade. And if it had not been for the southern states, we would have banned slavery completely. Every northern state had banned slavery by 1804. It just took the southern states getting on board after the Civil War in 1865 before we banned it in the 13th Amendment. We would have been the first in the world to do that. New England was the first in the world to ban slavery as a nation, just the southern states weren't there yet. So you go back here with these kind of numbers and wait a minute, what's this stuff about the intolerant Christians? It doesn't quite look like it once you go back and see the history on it. So the due process, I mentioned due process, is significant. Due process is what we have in the 4th or the 8th Amendment of the Constitution. The right to confront your accuser, the right to speak in your own behalf, the right to compel witnesses in your defense, all those 4th through 8th Amendment stuff. If you take Justice Stephen Breyer, now I've been involved in 13 cases at the U.S. Supreme Court, and in my opinion, I think Justice Breyer is the most secular and the most liberal justice we've had in the history of the court. Kennedy might give him a run, Justice Kennedy from 20 years ago, but I think Breyer certainly holds that place, and it's significant that Breyer, I was reading one of his opinions, and he said, well, of course, we all know that the due process rights in the Bill of Rights come out of the Bible. Really? We all know that? And he's saying they come out of the Bible, and he cited Federal Practice and Procedure, Volume 30. Now, Federal Practice and Procedure is what you use for practice federal law, and I think it's currently 169 volumes long. So Federal Practice and Procedure, 169 volumes. Volume 30 deals with evidence. And in Volume 30, it points out that the right to confront your accuser came out of John 8:10. And if you go through the other things, the right to, for example, compel witnesses on your behalf, Proverbs 18:17. The right to speak in your own defense, Acts 22:1, and on it goes. And that goes back to the Pilgrims. Due process rights go, see, these guys spent time in the Word, no question about it. And I told you virtually any picture you see of the Pilgrims, you'll see the Bible with them. You see the Bible there? Let me help. Everybody's got one. They were called the people of the book. See, that's the difference between Jamestown and Plymouth. It's not that we didn't have two separate colonies who arrived here that both had Christian purposes. We had the people of the book here. These guys were professing evangelical Christians, but they were also biblical Christians. They made mistakes, but they got out of them in a hurry, and they set a model for the rest of America to follow. And so much of what we do today really goes back to the Pilgrims. So I want to close with a comparison of the two. We looked at the Tale of Two Cities. I want to show you a wall map. Education, 1888. Imagine a big wall map up here for the students to see. And the wall map, as you can see right there, you see that there are two things going across the nation. I'm going to walk over here for a minute. See up here, a ship and a ship. See these two ships? Up here, 1619, well, it's actually 1607, but we call it 1619 project. And up here you got 1620. Now, if you can see right here, I'll blow that up. What you have right there is, it says $1 and Mammon. Oh, it's an economic colony. It was all about making money. Now, they had an impact, and they show you the impact across here. You see the impact across here? It's avarice, lust, ignorance, superstition, secession, sedition, rebellion, Dred Scott decision, Kansas-Nebraska Act, Fugitive Slave Law, the Compromise, 1850, the Missouri Compromise. All the bad things that we would point to related particularly to racial relations came out of that stream, if you will. Then you also have a second stream up here, and you see that one? If I blow it up, it says Bible. Oh, it was founded on the Bible. It too had an impact across America, and it's free schools and knowledge and free speech and contentment and industry and sobriety and philanthropy and love of country, patriotism, equal rights, obedience. See, all these good things, no question, both of them had an impact. But this is the one that's been more important in defining America than this one is. This one had an impact, but it was overcome by this impact. That Bible stuff right there is what made the difference. And this is what we used to have in education. Wall charts like this, we acknowledge who we are as a people and that we made mistakes, but we also acknowledge how we overcame those mistakes, and it was through the scriptures, through pointing at the Bible. So that literally is the tale of two cities. There were Christians involved in both, but one was professing and one was biblical. And we have the same thing today. And by the way, last year, if you saw, Last year in Congress, U.S. Congress, 91% of members of Congress profess to be Christians. How does the policy look coming out of Congress? Not very Christian. Professing Christians, biblical Christians. This year, it's 88% of members of Congress profess to be Christians. Doesn't look like a whole lot of biblical policy coming out of there. That's because we don't have that biblical worldview that was there. So that's the tale of two cities, and there is definitely a difference between the two. But that helps kind of set the founding for America. And it was really the positive things that went on to grow into what became the Declaration of Independence, to what became who we are today 250 years later. Both of those beginnings are very, very important. And there's a lot of great stuff to be learned from both of them. But it really was the influence of the Bible that survived that made us into the nation we were. Tim? If you're interested in this kind of stuff, WallBuilders.com, we have things like the American Story, and all this stuff is available on Amazon as well. But the American Story goes back to the Tale of Two Cities. It goes back to Columbus and goes through and looks at both of those. The American Story 2 looks at the American founding, the first 7 presidents who were all founding fathers, who all had some role in the American Revolution. And then if you get into the Founders Bible, this is where that we've gone back through all those writings and used the Bible verses that were used to create policies, like what you saw here on due process, etc. The Bible verses that were used to create the policies that have been beneficial, that's where you can find in those books.
Okay, as we are gearing up for the 250th, there's a lot of conversations that we should be having. I want to offer some thoughts of reasons we should be celebrating America, because just as much as I would contend we're seeing a resurgence of some pro-America things, there is going to be a very strong opposition. The reason we wanted to show some of the 1619 project ideas is because this is what's going to lead a lot of the opposition of why America's bad, foundationally, etc. But it's worth noting, in the midst of 250 years, we have enjoyed more freedom, stability, and prosperity than any other nation in the world for those 250 years. There are things very unique about America, and even looking at the Constitution, there was a group of professors several years ago that asked what maybe should be a pretty basic question. Looking at America now, this was actually on the 200th anniversary of the U.S. Constitution. We've now exceeded that, but there were professors from the University of Chicago Law School, and they said, seeing what's happening, there's been a lot of stability and longevity. What is the average length of a constitution in the history of the world? Now, that's a fair question. You can go back and look at thousands of years of recorded human history. There have been thousands of nations in that time. And what these professors discovered is that the average length of a constitution in world history is 17 years. Now, 17 to 19, depending on factors, but generally 17 years is what they came up with. This is also a good thing to keep in mind as we talk about America enjoying more stability, freedom, and prosperity. We, looking at our form of government, 250 years ago we became a nation. Well, then we did the Constitution. The Constitution we did in 1787, the Constitution is 239 years old. We celebrated a birthday on September 17th of this year, and every single September 17th on Constitution Day, we set a new world record for the nation living the longest under a single governing document. So this is a pretty significant thing, and also along these lines, when there were professors wanting to know, why has the Constitution worked so well for so long? Well, why has ours lasted when, if you look at so many other nations, they've had to redo or revamp or rewrite forms of government and constitution? Why has ours been stable? And specifically, there was a professor from the University of Houston. His name was Donald Lutz. He led this study, and he started this actually back in the 1970s. And his basic question was, where did the founding fathers come up with the ideas that they put in the Constitution? Because whatever they put in has worked really, really well. And doing this, what he thought was, if we go back and study the founders' writings, if we'll go through their writings and let's find who they quote in their writings, if we see who they quoted, then we'll know who influenced them, we'll know where their ideas came from, and then we'll know what ideas led to the Constitution. His initial proposal was, let's look up about 15,000, he called them representative writings from the founding fathers. Now, anybody that's ever done research, if you don't think of research in our era, back up to the 1970s and 80s, when there is no internet. And if you're going to read a writing of the Founding Fathers and you're looking for something in quotation marks, and then, so I find Benjamin Franklin quoted somebody, and I go, okay, who did he quote? What do we do? Well, Donald Lutz, this professor, worked with many other professors, and they had some grad students, helpful for them. So the way that research would have to be done, you'd go to the library, and you would say, okay, everybody, here's the quote we're looking for. Now, everybody get a book, and let me know if you find it. And you just have to start reading, right? Like, this is the way research used to be done. You just go looking. Well, they're looking for 15,000 of these Founding Father documents, looking for quotes that they can see who they're quoting. And their idea was basically we're gonna make like this Excel spreadsheet. We're gonna put in all the people they're quoting, and then we'll kind of rank and see who they quote the most. Well, they ended up finding 3,154 quotes. From those quotes, and just even finding this, again, like side note, this is the 1970s and 1980s. Just finding those quotes took them 10 years to track them back to the original source. With AI now, you could do that in like 10 seconds. You know, like it's such a different world. But they did all of this research, 1970s, 1980s, trying to figure out where do these ideas come from. And they put their findings together in a book called The Origins of American Constitutionalism. It still is a book worth going back and reviewing, because they do document where the Founding Fathers were the most influenced. The people they quoted the most, they referenced the most, it lays it out very well. And what they identified is the number one quoted individual in the Founders' writings was Charles Montesquieu. He did The Spirit of the Laws, very influential for the Founding Fathers. The second most quoted was William Blackstone. He did Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, very formative for a lot of the common law legal code in America. John Locke also was the very quoted, but third most quoted guy from the Founding Fathers. Now, they were looking at writings for this study. They were looking at writings from 1760 to about 1805. So it's a 45-year gap period, but they wanted to see, okay, leading up to the American Revolution, then the Revolution, then you have, after the Revolution, you have the Constitutional Convention, the Constitution, you have the first couple presidents. So they're looking in that time frame. What they identified, John Locke was the most quoted by the Founding Fathers during the American Revolution. But nearly every quote of John Locke was only during the Revolution, and after that he wasn't very quoted. But he's the guy that came up with life, liberty, property. Jefferson made it life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So those are the top three quoted individuals in the Founders' writings. But what the professors acknowledged is, even though those are the top cited individuals, it wasn't the top cited source. The most quoted source by the Founding Fathers was the Bible, and 34% of all the quotes they found in the Founders' writings came from the Bible. What is again worth noting is Donald Lutz was asked about this, because for people that have read the Founding Fathers' writings, and we read a lot of their writings at WallBuilders, I can tell you the Founding Fathers quoted the Bible all the time and did not have it in quotation marks. There were so many obvious biblical references, and so Donald Lutz was asked, if you included these biblical references, what would that look like? And he said, well, for the parameters of the study, we only included what's in quotation marks because, right, that makes it easier for the parameters of study. But if we included the obvious Bible references and acknowledgments we found in their writings, that number would have been far higher than 34%. And we would affirm that's correct. In fact, it would have been over 40%. It probably would have been closer to 50%. And I think it would have been higher, but I think 50% is probably a fair estimate, that we're not overstating it more than we could justify. But again, I think I could justify even more. Here's the point. Even with just the parameters, 34% of the quotes from the Founding Fathers came from the Bible. The number one source from the Founding Fathers was the Bible. And again, the reason it matters is because this is the greatest influence on the Founding Fathers, which was the point of the study, is what influenced them the most. Let me go full circle with this. The reason it matters, we're talking about why was America the most free, stable, prosperous nation in the world? Well, the guys that put this form of government together that made us the most stable, free, prosperous nation in the history of the world were influenced more by the Bible than by anything else, and it wasn't even close. Okay? To go further, you can point to the Founders' writings. John Adams, in 1813, he wrote Thomas Jefferson a letter, and this is at a point in 1813, they have now... They really come to know each other during the American Revolution. They're part of the early Congresses, which Congress first meets in 1774. So this is now like 40 years after the first Congress met. And during the American Revolution, John Adams and Jefferson, they're allies. They work closely together. They're in the Committee of Five that is the original draft of the Declaration. They're working as diplomats over in Europe throughout the Revolution. When George Washington becomes president, they both serve on George Washington's administration in his White House. At the end of Washington's presidency, in his second term, they start to have a falling out over some of Washington's policies. They have disagreements. Well, they both run to be the second president of the United States. And at this point in American political history, there was not a president and vice president running on the same ticket, right? This was the time when whoever got the most votes was president, whoever got the second most votes was vice president. So your vice president is the person you just ran against. Imagine if Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, right? We're like, that would be actually, I would pay for that show. I would sign up for that every day. But this is kind of what happens. John Adams is chosen the president. Thomas Jefferson got the second most votes, so he's the vice president. And they're working for the nation together. Obviously, you can imagine there's friction as it goes. When John Adams runs for re-election, he loses his re-election bid to Jefferson. And at this point, they have a falling out. They don't talk again. And it was over a decade before one of the other founding fathers, his name was Benjamin Rush, a very noted founding father, he wrote to both of them and said, y'all are both being crazy, right? Like, your little girls feel the feelings hurt. You got to get over this. You're too important to America. That guys who contributed as much as you did, who worked together so well, you shouldn't end your life with this broken kind of dynamic. And so he works to help get them back together. And when they start writing letters, this is one of the early letters that they wrote, 1813. And John Adams, in this letter, they're finding, he and Jefferson are finding common ground again. But in the letter he writes, he says, remember, like, decades ago, it was nearly 40 years ago. Remember when we first got together, the group of us, we were young men back then. We had all these ideas and ambitions, and we were so divided on so many sentiments. And he's just reminiscing of the early days. And one of the things he points out is in the midst of their great division, they were able to find common ground to work together. And here's part of where he said they found common ground. He said, the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. Now, I would encourage you to go read the whole letter, and there's a lot in that letter. It's a very long letter, but he goes through some of these ideas, but here's the point, is he says, in the midst of our disagreements, where we found the common ground, it was ultimately Christianity. Today, people might look at a guy like John Adams and think, wait a second, that seems kind of crazy that you would suggest that John Adams thought Christianity, or that the founding fathers thought Christianity was foundational. And it's only in our modern era that we think this is a crazy thought. We could back up to people in earlier generations, and noted historians, by the way. Alice Baldwin, for example, she was a professor at Duke University. She started the women's program at Duke University. She was there in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. In 1928, she wrote a book called The New England Clergy and the American Revolution. And in this book, she actually identified that if you look at the Declaration and all the things that were there, she said, when the founding fathers put these ideas together, none of the ideas in the Declaration were unique to the founding fathers, meaning they didn't come up with the idea. She said instead, every single clause of the Declaration had been preached from American pulpits prior to 1763. Now, in her book, The New England Clergy and the American Revolution, you actually can find that book online. The last 5 pages is the conclusion, where she ties it all together. So even just look online, find the 5 pages, read the 5-page conclusion, and you would get a really good idea for what she's communicating, that it was the pastors leading the way on this, and it was their sermons that laid the foundation. When the founding fathers come together and they're saying, what should we do? All they did was take what they'd been learning from their pastors in the decades leading up to this moment, and that's what became the Declaration. Also worth noting, at the end of her conclusion, she has an appendix, and in the appendix, it's all the sermons that have all the clauses from the Declaration. So she's literally showing, here's where it is, here's where it came from. And again, people about the founding fathers think, wait a second, the idea that the founding fathers were influenced by their pastors, were influenced by Christianity, were influenced by the Bible, it seems far-fetched. Again, it's only far-fetched because how little of our history we know. If we actually just walked through the story, the very time the founding fathers came together was September 6, 1774. When they met, the very first motion of their first meeting was to open with prayer. And there's a really famous painting depicting that opening prayer session they had together. And anybody who's a believer that sees the famous painting, you go, you know what? That posture, totally know what's happening right now. Yeah, clearly this is a prayer meeting. Well, part of how we know what happens, all the guys who were there largely kept journals, and so their records are very evident, but an easy one to point to is John Adams. He wrote Abigail about this, and it was like a week after it happened. He writes Abigail, and he says, Abigail, it was kind of amazing what happened. He said, when we first met, he says, Mr. Thomas Cushing in Massachusetts, he made the first motion. And the motion he made was that we should open with prayer. And actually, there were some debates on this because you had John Jay and you had Edward Rutledge who were like, I'm not sure we can pray with that guy. Because back in the day, the Congregationalists were largely more of the northern influence. That was the Pilgrim descendants. They were the Congregationalists. Well, when you come to some of like Virginia, they were Anglican. Well, the Pilgrims left England because of the Anglicans, and their descendants are like, we never liked you guys, and we're not sure this is going to work. Well, it's not that John Jay and Edward Rutledge didn't believe in prayer. Literally, there was the bitterness of sentiments about we don't like those guys. And John Adams says it was at this point that Sam Adams stood up. And Sam Adams said he was no bigot, and as long as they chose a pastor who feared God and loved the nation, that pastor could lead them in prayer. Well, that pastor they chose, and actually Sam Adams nominated, was a local Anglican or Episcopalian pastor, the Reverend Jacob Duché. He's the one that shows up and leads them in prayer. And what's amazing about this, John Adams actually writes about this some, but it's even in the records of Congress. There's records of Congress for every single meeting of Congress, and there's records from the very beginning. The records of Congress indicate that when they met and opened with prayer, that opening prayer lasted for nearly 2 hours. Now, I love Jesus a lot, but I would like to maybe be informed about a 2-hour prayer meeting before I showed up, right? So I'm mentally preparing myself to be spiritual in the moment. This isn't even like the spiritual leaders of the nation, right? These aren't like the most religious ones. No, these are the most politically vocal ones. And the most politically vocal ones are the ones who said, we better make sure we get God's help in the midst of this. Actually, John Adams says that one of the things that happened is in the midst of their prayer, somebody suggested they should read from the Book of Common Prayer, specifically the Book of Common Prayer written back in the 1600s. It had ascribed Bible verses or chapters for every day. So it's a Bible reading plan. And so there were ascribed chapters for every day. And John Adams says, Abigail, one of the chapters we read that morning was Psalm 35, and it was as if God himself had ordained that psalm to be read. Here's part of that portion of the letter from John Adams. He says, Abigail must beg you to read that psalm. Read the 35th Psalm to your friends. Read it to your father. Well, Psalm 35 is one of the psalms that David wrote when King Saul was chasing him. And David says, God, I've done nothing. And he seeks my destruction. Lord, you rise up, be my shield, my buckler, my strong right arm. On it goes for 28 verses. As David is crying out to God, in the end, David concludes that God will be his shield and buckler. And John Adams says to Abigail, now you must remember, when we're reading Psalm 35, we had just gotten word that the British had surrounded Boston Harbor, the fleet, and they had begun cannonading Boston Harbor. And so it was as if God himself had ordained that psalm to be read, that we were being unjustly targeted, persecuted, but God would be our deliverer. Well, this is part of what happens that day. And then John Adams writes Abigail a letter a couple weeks later and says something else that Congress had done. He says, Abigail, we have appointed a continental fast. Now, he's talking about the Continental Congress. One of the actions that Congress took is they called on all 13 colonies to a day of prayer and fasting, which in that letter, John Adams tells Abigail, millions will be upon their knees at once before their great creator, imploring his forgiveness and blessings, his smile on American council and arms. Now, this is John Adams telling Abigail what he thinks is going to happen. There's only about 3 million colonists at that time, estimates are. So when John Adams says millions are going to be upon their knees, I think he's assuming everybody's going to pray, which might be overly ambitious, but it also says something about the way he viewed America at that time, that we were people of faith. And if it was time to pray, we were going to show up and pray. And it wasn't very long after this that they begin to see results of this. But let me also point out, when this call to prayer happens, this is something else that most Americans don't know. We haven't really been taught of so much of the faith foundation, even with the idea of prayer proclamations. The idea of government setting aside a day to have prayer and fasting, or even prayer and thanksgiving, was a very common thought in early America. In fact, by 1815, there were more than 1,400 examples of government prayer proclamations done by presidents, by governors, or by Congress, and that was from the New England states alone. So whenever someone says, well, the founding fathers weren't really that religious, or one of my favorites, that either they were atheists or they were agnostics or they were deists or there's a separation of church and state, just remember this one right here, okay? Because for any of those, when people say the founding fathers were atheists don't believe in God. An agnostic says that there's no way to know for sure if God exists. And a deist says, well, God does exist, but God doesn't get involved in the affairs of men. It's like the clockmaker theory that God wound it up, God turned the world loose, and so we're on our own. If you're an atheist, agnostic, or deist, you know what you're never going to do? That. Not even one time, much less 1,400 times by 1815. Well, this is literally what the Continental Congress does. And as I mentioned, there were different kinds of prayer proclamations. During the American Revolution, Congress did 15 prayer proclamations. Some were for prayer and fasting, and some were for prayer and thanksgiving. And you probably could make some logical conclusions and connections with this. They started with prayer and fasting, saying, we need God's intervention, so we're going to have some time of prayer and fasting, asking for God to move. Well, guess why they would have days of prayer and thanksgiving? Because after days of prayer and fasting, asking for God to intervene, they would see moments and they were like, look what God did. We need to go back and thank God for what God did. So they'd have a day of prayer and thanksgiving. Then they'd have a day of prayer and fasting. And God would move. They'd have a day of prayer and thanksgiving, thanking God for what God did. This is the way it was in the American Revolution 15 times. And the very first proclamation was for prayer and thanksgiving. And it wasn't very long after Congress had made this initial call to prayer and thanksgiving that John actually writes Abigail another letter. And I am referencing a lot of John and Abigail Adams' letters on purpose because that's a very easy one-stop shop source to go look up. John and Abigail Adams wrote 1,100 letters to each other from the American Revolution and into their life. They talked about basically everything. In fact, John Adams says some of the best intelligence he got from the Revolution was because of Abigail and the work Abigail did, and so many stories I don't have time to get into, but I will tell you, they're some of the most informative letters you can read, and if you are someone who likes the Hallmark Channel, you would love their letters. John Adams is a hopeless romantic. Abigail's a girl, so it works perfect. And I mean, let's be fair on this, okay? But John, like to give you a sense of the flavor, John has a letter where, in essence, he starts off saying, Abigail, I'm suffocating because I haven't seen you in a week and a half, and you are the air that I breathe. And that's when I would change the channel, right? Like, that's too much Hallmark. But if you like Hallmark, you'd love their letters. In their letters, John writes Abigail and says, Abigail, and this was in 1777. He says, Abigail, it's amazing what is happening right now, what God has been doing. And he goes down a list. And the letter really is worth going back and looking at. Because he says, this colonel was just attacked by a British officer and their regiment, and he repelled them. This officer and this militia, and it wasn't even the army yet, they repelled them. He says, then over here, it was Colonel Smith and his men. They attacked this British outpost, and we defeated the British. And he goes through just listing these battle moments where it was totally unexpected. We shouldn't be able to repel the British. We shouldn't overcome the British. Great Britain was the #1 military power in the world at the time. We were a bunch of rednecks, right, with muskets. We hadn't even figured this thing out yet. But then he says, Abigail, we just had a galley, which is a ship, destroy a 64-gun British man of warship and a 20-gun British man of warship. Now, that's even more impressive because we were in the process of building a navy, but we didn't have a navy yet. If you ever go to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian Museum of American History, up on the 3rd floor, they have one of the very first ships of the American Navy. It's called the Gunboat Philadelphia. Now, this is where the Navy begins. What happened is whatever boats we had, whatever ships we could find, we just put cannons on them. And we're like, all right, let's go fight these guys, which is as redneck as you can be, right, in these moments. But John Adams says, Abigail, it's crazy. We just destroyed a 64-gun British man of warship and a 20-gun British man of warship. That's a naval vessel, one that has 20 cannons, one that has 64 cannons. And our, like, rowboats, right? Like, it's crazy. It doesn't even make sense what's happening. Now, he does say it's a galley, so we were building bigger ships, but he acknowledged none of this makes sense. Like, we should not be winning any of these encounters And then he writes her another letter. He says, Abigail, I was eating dinner tonight, and there were men at a table eating dinner behind me, and I was listening to them talk. And as they were trying to analyze and assess all that's going on, one of them stood up very adamantly and said, you can't forget the most important thing happening right now. And he went on to explain in a very stern explanation what was, I think, the best explanation of what actually is happening right now. This is John Adams writing Abigail. He said, I think it's the best explanation. And this is what he wrote her was the best explanation of what was actually happening. He said, it appears to me the eternal Son of God is operating powerfully against the British nation. Now, this is John Adams being like, these guys were all eating dinner. Somebody's like, wait a second. You can't miss the point. Here's what's happening. Well, right. They're like, how is this happening? Somebody's like, I can tell you. It's Jesus. That's the only thing that's making sense right now. Well, let me point out, John Adams writes Abigail and says, I think that is the best explanation. I agree with this. And why does it matter? That explanation doesn't come from people that think there should be a separation of church and state. That explanation didn't come from atheists, agnostics, or deists. No, that came from people who literally had been crying out to God to intervene on their behalf. And then when they recognize we're having experiences that don't make sense, Jesus must be helping us right now. Right. This is where they're coming from. And by the way, it wasn't just John Adams that noted this. Jumping forward a year and a half, George Washington, who would understand probably God's providence in the military better than anybody else, because you can back up to his days in the French and Indian War, the Battle of Monongahela, where he got the kind of moniker that he was the bulletproof guy. Amazing. George Washington had seen God's providence throughout military his entire life, essentially, especially his adult life. But by the time he gets 1778, he wrote General Thomas Nelson Jr. a letter. And Thomas Nelson Jr. was a signer of the Declaration from Virginia, and then joins the military, becomes a general under George Washington. And Washington writes him, telling him about how evident it is to Washington that God is moving in so many ways on our behalf. And here's part of what he wrote in that letter to Thomas Nelson. He said, the hand of providence has been so conspicuous in all this that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith and more than wicked that has not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligations. So Washington's saying, if somebody just looks at these battles, if they can't see the hand of God in the midst of this, they must be worse than an infidel, an unbeliever, or more than wicked if they can't acknowledge that God's been a part of this. But his next line is my favorite. He says, but it will be time enough for me to turn preacher when my present appointment ceases, and therefore I shall add no more on the doctrine of providence. George Washington's like, I've seen enough miracles, I could become a pastor. But for right now, my present appointment, I'm going to try to focus on winning this war, and I'm going to leave the rest alone for now. This is how obvious it was to the guys who were there. They saw over and over and over God's hand in the midst of what they were doing. And by the way, they've been praying for God's hand to be part of what they're doing, so they're quick to acknowledge it when it actually does happen. When you finally come to the end of the revolution, this is another really important thing to note. The end of the revolution, these are the three Americans that signed the Peace Treaty of Paris. On the left is John Jay, the middle is John Adams, on the right is Benjamin Franklin. They're the ones that signed the Peace Treaty of Paris, which is a document that formally ends the American Revolution. It brought peace between us and Great Britain and established America as a free and independent nation. Over on the bottom left, you see there's 4 signatures. The top one with the ribbon, that's David Hartley. He was the British ambassador. And then below that, you see John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay. Again, this is the document that ends the American Revolution. It brings peace between us and Great Britain. It established America as a free and independent nation. And look at the title of the document. In the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. America became a nation in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And it's literally on the top of the document. Now, here's what's crazy about this. Everything that I have just told you, I literally was only quoting from original letters, or I'm showing you actual governing documents. And yet, most people have never heard any of this. And I would ask, right? If you go back and think about the textbooks you had, how many of them showed the Peace Treaty of Paris? Most Americans have never seen this, never heard of this. And this is the problem, is that the things that should have been far more obvious to us, we've never been taught. So we don't understand the foundation. But when John Adams is thinking now, 40 years after the beginning of the revolution, he writes Jefferson and he says, how do we do this? It was the general principles of Christianity. Like, that's how we pulled this off. If you actually know the story, you go, well, that's exactly what they did. They found common ground on the principles of faith and Christianity, inspired by what they had read in their Bible, influenced by their pastors. This is how they pulled it off. And to give you even more indication, when we finish the revolution, we write the Constitution, when George Washington becomes a president, George Washington serves for 2 terms, and George Washington is the indispensable man. There's maybe not enough good things we could say about George Washington for his contributions to America. But at the end of his presidency, he delivered what's considered the most significant political address ever done by a president in his farewell address. And in his farewell address, he gave advice on how America could succeed going forward. And part of the advice he gave, he actually warned against making sure we don't love party more than we love principle, because if you love party more than principle, then you'll compromise your principles in favor of your party, like things that we are literally seeing happen in our nation today. He talked about making sure that we don't get so involved in foreign entanglements that we're losing sight of putting America first. Again, like things that are pretty relevant for us today. There's a lot of great advice, but the one thing I'm going to draw your attention to, he said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, and let me point out, he's talking about ultimately what helps America succeed as a nation. That's political prosperity. So he says of all of the things we could do that would help America politically succeed, he said religion and morality are indispensable supports. In the entire farewell address, there's only one thing he said was indispensable. That means you cannot do it without this. The only thing America cannot survive without is religion and morality. He continued, in vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars. Anybody that opposes religion and morality, he says, they don't love America, because this is the foundation of America. Now, to give you even more indication of this, the following year when John Adams became president, John Adams in the next year, 1798, he wrote a letter to the militia of Massachusetts. And I would encourage you to look this letter up. I think it's 4, maybe 5 paragraphs. It's not very long. And there's some really profound things in it, but the most famous line from this letter, he says, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Our Constitution, our system of government only works with a moral and religious people. Now, why? Why would he say this? Because in America, we built our nation on the idea of giving freedom to people. But freedom only works if you have a moral underpinning. Because if you give freedom to immoral people, it looks like Chicago every weekend, right? Like, that's not a good situation. So freedom only works if you have a moral underpinning. And this is why they said you have to have religion and morality. And today, a lot of people would look at the Founding Fathers and say, wait a second, but our Constitution, it was secular. They believed in these secular ideas. That's what's been promoted today. It's just, that's not true. If you go back and look at even other historians, Stephen Caldwell was a historian, a political writer back in the mid-19th century, the mid-1800s, and he wrote a book about the Founding Fathers and the Constitution, and his whole book has this tone. I'm going to read only a couple sentences from one section of his book, but his whole book is consistent with this idea. But here's part of what he said about the Founding Fathers. It was in the spirit of true Christianity that the hospitality and blessings of the United States were offered to all the world. All were invited to enjoy it. The Christian men of that day intended that the nation should continue to be a Christian nation. They did not place Christianity beneath nor over their political institutions. Rather, it was to be the atmosphere which they breathed to administer them. It was the source of their inspiration, and they sought to make the blessings available for human advantage. These institutions and laws were to be the instruments of Christian men for the good of the whole human family. Now, he goes on and on explaining a lot of the Christian connection, but I want to back up to one of the phrases he said. He said Christianity was the atmosphere that they breathed who created this document. If we look today, we would think that's a pretty bold statement. How could you make that statement? I would point out, even looking at this painting, you could draw that conclusion if you paid enough attention to the painting. Now, I'm going to draw your attention to something, but let me tell you the background. This was done in 1940, but in 1937, on the 150th anniversary of the Constitution, Congress determined they wanted to do a painting to honor the Founding Fathers, Constitutional Convention, and at the time, there was a stairwell on the way to the House floor. This painting actually hangs there. At the time, the stairwell, that big wall was empty. And they said, we got a big space. It's 20 feet tall. It's 30 feet wide. They contracted the most famous painter of that time. His name was Howard Christie, so they contract with him, and he was going to come do this painting. And Howard Christie, to do this painting, which actually, it's kind of like a like image. It's a mural of all these guys. You actually can tell who everyone is, life image of them. He said, I wanted to represent them well, so he said, if I'm going to do this, I want to learn a little bit more about them, so maybe I can present some of their personality in the painting, was his idea. He starts to read their writing, starts to learn about them, and the same thing that we've talked about, he discovered they quoted the Bible a lot. They were influenced by the Bible. They appreciated and venerated the Bible, and if you go back and look at the Constitutional Convention, there is no record of what books or resources they had in the room with them. But Howard Christie said, seeing how much they talked about the Bible, seeing how highly they spoke of the Bible, I couldn't imagine people that were so familiar with and valued the Bible so much, I couldn't imagine they would have come together and not had a Bible with them. So I included a Bible in the painting. The Bible is hidden in plain sight. All of us have seen this painting. Most of us never knew there was a Bible there. Well, the painting is 20 feet tall, 30 feet wide. The painting was large enough, he actually painted the words on the Bible. You actually can go up and see it on the stairwell. You can literally read the words off of it. So what's it open to? It's open to Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount. The reason I want to point this out is because literally the guy who did the painting just went back and read their writings. Like, they quote the Bible all the time, and they spoke highly of the Bible. They were clearly influenced by the Bible. I'm putting the Bible in the painting. This is what we used to know about the foundations of America. And today people would say, now wait a second. We're not supposed to have the Bible in government or politics, right? People want to argue today, well, there's separation of church and state. And if you suggest we should have the Bible, then they would accuse you of being a Christian nationalist, right? Like, this is the modern narrative today. And I just want to point out, as a Christian, you need to think a little better about this, because God created institutions. And from the institutions, like, just start in Genesis. God created the family first, and then God created government, and then God created the church. But guess who was over them all? God. The idea that we can have an institution and somehow we're supposed to say that God's not going to be part of the institution that he created, it's utterly ludicrous. But people would say, wait a second, yes, but we're not supposed to legislate morality. And I would point out that's one of the dumbest statements, like on the list of dumb things Christians say, that's up there. This is super dumb to say. Why? Because every piece of legislation is a reflection of somebody's morality. Somebody thought this was right or this was wrong, and that's why we passed a law saying we will do this, or we passed a law saying we won't do this. It's not a question of do we legislate morality. It's only a question of whose morality is going to be legislated. And what we have seen over the last many decades is we have legislated a secular progressive morality. And how was our nation done for? Not very well. The founding fathers understood there is a basic moral framework that should guide what we do, even in the legislative process. And the idea that we would disconnect God from that is so crazy. Also, it's a reflection of how little we understand about the American government to begin with. Because if you back up, we could talk about the Pilgrims, and actually I could go through a lot of examples. I'm choosing the easiest one. This is the most simplistic one, okay? So there's lots of others, but this is the obvious one, the lowest hanging fruit on the tree. We're pulling this one off, okay? When the Pilgrims come in 1620, 10 years later, you have the Puritans. And it was known as the Great Puritan Migration. Initially, when you have John Winthrop comes, he leads 1,000 Puritans, and over the next 10 years, it's somewhere between 10 and 20,000 additional Puritans that come. When John Winthrop came, he delivered a sermon to the Puritans. When they're coming over, he says, guys, this is what we are going to do. That sermon was so famous, it was published, it was distributed. All of the Puritans joining in this Puritan colony, they're very familiar with the sermon. They've listened to it. They've probably heard it multiple times, maybe even anniversary sermons delivered every year. I'm saying this important context. The sermon was called A Model of Christian Charity. And there's parts of this you probably have heard before, and if not, you can go back and read the whole sermon. But part of the sermon, he says, for we must consider that we shall be a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. What he was pointing out, we are going to a place to show how doing it God's way works best. We're going to be a city on a hill. Everybody's going to look at us, and they're going to see, okay, those guys are trying to do it. He says, and if we do it in a way that dishonors God, if we don't do it right, we're going to become a reproach and a byword. This was the idea. The idea behind this, ultimately, we can go back to the Pilgrims. There's lots of examples I can give, but this was known as a covenantal system, that we were making a covenant with God, that we were going to try to do it God's way. This was the idea in the origins of America. That was the same idea that many of the founding fathers had. Again, I'm not taking time to go through in the weeds on this. I'm trying to use the easy examples. But let me point out one more easy example where somebody made this connection. The son of John Adams was John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams grew up in the middle of the Revolution. He knew every single founding father personally. He was very connected. He actually served in the government, either in the White House or in the Senate on every one of the first 5 administrations. He became the 6th president of the United States. After he was president, he went back to Congress. He's the leader of the anti-slavery movement. The guy's life was amazing. He ends up going back and giving a speech. It was an anniversary speech more than 60 years after the Declaration was done. And this was his anniversary speech. You can find the whole thing online. But he asks a couple of rhetorical questions and then offers an answer. This is the anniversary speech of the Declaration of Independence. He's speaking to a crowd in Connecticut. Here's what he told them. He said, "Why is it that next to the birthday of the Savior of the world, your most joyous and most venerated festival returns on this day?" So he's telling the crowd, why is it, rhetorical question, why is it that Christmas is obviously, for good reason, the most important, but 4th of July is your second most important? Why would that be? Now, again, he's going to ask some more questions. He's going to point out what the answer is. I think it's interesting, though. He's talking to a largely Christian audience, saying that we know Jesus, right, his birth is your most important, and 4th of July is your second most important, which I would contend, I feel like Resurrection Sunday, pretty big one. We should include that one too. But after that, 4th of July, Thanksgiving, you nailed it. Those are mine. Let me show you what he says in this. He says, "Is it not that in the chain of human events, the birthday of the nation is indissolubly linked with the birthday of the Savior? That it forms a leading event in the progress of the gospel dispensation? Is it not that the Declaration of Independence first organized the social compact on the foundation of the Redeemer's mission upon the earth, that it laid the cornerstone of human government upon the first precepts of Christianity?" Now, hang on a second. He's saying the American government took all the ideas of Christianity and he said, it laid the cornerstone of human government on the precepts of Christianity. This is him saying we were doing something very Christian in our system of government. Yes, because they understood what the covenant had been from the beginning, and they were following up with those ideals in a lot of what they were doing. And I understand today that people would point and say, wait a second, you're seeming to suggest that all the founding fathers were really pro-Christian. And actually, yes, I actually largely would suggest that. However, I know people are going to say, but wait a second, what about the deist founding fathers? And I would contend, first of all, that of these founding fathers that you're probably referencing, none of them were deists in the way that you think and understand this. And people say, no, Franklin was, we know he was. And I would say, how do we know he was? Well, because he was, right. Why do you think he was a deist? Well, everybody says he was a deist. Why? And a lot of times we repeat the narrative we've heard and we've never done the research. I would encourage you, do some research. And let me help you know where to do research. Go to his autobiography. Why? Because that's the only place he ever self-identified as a deist. And you can go online and find it. You can do a quick word search, put in the word deist, it'll pull it up. It's a page and a half is all you need to read, and it gives you everything you need to know about this. What he says was, when I was 15, I was reading the debates between some ministers and some deists. And as I read their exchanges back and forth, it occurred to me that the deists were making better arguments than these ministers. So I determined I would be a deist. And my friends became deists. But I quickly noticed that my friends, no longer governed by the moral code of Christianity, their behavior became very bad, and I didn't like the way they treated me, and I realized that even though deism might have some correct assessments and points, that the system itself was of no benefit to society and really of no value to me, so I left that belief behind. That's what he said about being a deist. Okay. By his own acknowledgement, now by the way, he says I quickly left that belief behind. By his own acknowledgement, he was a deist for maybe a month and a half, right? Maybe a week and a half. I don't know. He doesn't say. This is the only founding father that ever self-identifies as a deist. It's in his autobiography, and he talks about he tried it on. He didn't like the way that people acted when they didn't have the guide of the moral code of Christianity, and so he left that belief behind. That's the only founding father that ever self-identifies as a deist, and yet today people say, well, see, this is how we know they didn't believe in God, they were deists. That's totally ridiculous. Let me give you further indication. If all you did was read their writings, you would draw different conclusions. Why do we say that? Franklin was one of 6 guys that not only signed the Declaration, he was one of the guys that also helped do the Constitution. He signed the Constitution as well 11 years later, and while they were there, when the Founding Fathers came together to do the Constitution, at that time, the colonies had sent delegations, and in the delegations, many of them came with their own plans of the way the new form of government should work. So you have these delegations of Founding Fathers, and they have their plan laid out, and this is the New Jersey plan, this is the Virginia plan, this is the New York plan, and they come together and they take turns presenting their plans, and nobody liked anybody else's plan. So for the first 4.5 weeks, all they did was argue. It got so contentious, it was reported that George Mason from Virginia, he actually got up and left, and George Washington chases him down on the carriage and says, hey, George, you can't leave. We have paid too high a price getting to this point. We can't abandon the cause now. George Mason tells George Washington, I'll come back because I respect you. But I think we're wasting our time. I think this is ridiculous. It's never going to work. It was in the midst of this that Benjamin Franklin, the old man there, got up and gave the longest speech he gave during the entire Constitutional Convention. It was on June 28, 1787. It was his proposed solution of how to overcome their difficulties. And I'm only going to read you part of it, but it's pretty compelling what he says. He said, in this situation, this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish and present it to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding? Now, this is the guy considered the least religious founding father. His opening line is, guys, why haven't we prayed and asked God for help? He continues. He says, in the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. Now, I mentioned he's one of only 6 guys that signed the Declaration and the Constitution. Now, there was a few other signers of the Declaration in the room who didn't end up signing the Constitution, but the majority of the room are people who weren't there at the beginning. So he's giving them a history refresher. He says, guys, 11 years ago, we were here, and every single day we prayed in this room for divine protection. That's how we started off. Every day we prayed. He continued, our prayers were heard and they were graciously answered. All of us engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. And have we now forgotten this powerful friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need his assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs the affairs of men. If a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured in the sacred writings that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this. And I also believe without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel, and we shall become a reproach and a byword down to future ages. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessing on our deliberation be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business. That's the least religious founding father. And I would point out, one of the things he said is one of the things that we have culturally lost in our understanding of our nation. One of the things he said, quoting from the Bible, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain that build it. We have seen now a move in our nation of we want to make America great again. I actually fully support that idea. I think it's wonderful. But I also know you can only make her great again if you know what made her great in the first place. Well, the Bible is also really clear on this. It says righteousness exalts a nation. So how does a nation become great? Doing it God's way. Now, by the way, that could be true for families and marriages. It could be true for businesses and parenting, like all of it. Yes, do it God's way. It's just going to work better. But it's certainly true for our nation. And we have historic evidence to show this, that the reason our nation enjoyed more freedom, stability, prosperity, it's not because we never had problems. I mean, clearly, that is not why. But I would point out, there's people that want to say America's bad because of X, Y, or Z, because we had atrocities. There were, at times, evil people did evil things in our nation, and sometimes on behalf of our nation. How do we navigate that? And what I would point out is you pick any atrocity in American history you want. You pick any one. And I would say ask 2 questions. Number one, how did the atrocity come to an end? And number two, who led the opposition? And what you will discover without exception is any atrocity that ended in America, it ended because of the influence of Christians and Christian leaders in the church. The way it ended was Christians stood up and said, we're not doing that anymore. Why? They said, we're going to do it God's way. This was always the answer in our culture. Anytime we went the wrong direction, we got to do this God's way. Let's get back to this. And the last thing I would say, and kind of the closing thought, is our name WallBuilders comes from the Bible story of Nehemiah. If you go to the book of Nehemiah in the Bible, as Nehemiah looks at the walls that have been torn down, he's part of the Babylonian captivity, his heart's grieved, he wants to go back and rebuild the nation. There's a lot of important lessons we could draw from this, but our name WallBuilders actually comes from Nehemiah 2:17, where he says, come, let us rebuild, that we will no longer be a disgrace. Yes. We are calling on people to rebuild this thing, be a wall builder, and it's interesting, what Nehemiah initially said is everybody come live inside the city, and everybody builds what's right behind your house. Let's start there, and then let's work together and build the rest of this thing together. And there should be a challenge and a call for all of us in the midst of what we are looking at. And how do we celebrate the 250th? And we should, and this is amazing, but part of what we also should do and resolve, when the founding fathers got together, they pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honors for the sake of this nation. But it was bigger than just them sacrificing for the nation. They were sacrificing to do something that was even spiritually significant. And I would say in the midst of what we are navigating, we ought to say, okay, God, where have you called me with life, fortune, and sacred honor to do things spiritually significant for the cause of the nation and, by the way, for the next generation? And this is where we would invite you to join in this movement. Come, let us rebuild, that we will no longer be a disgrace. God bless you guys.